March 17, 1943, Caen, Normandy, France. Marcel Dupont pulled the morning's first batch of croissants from his stone oven at exactly 5:47 a.m., just as he had done every morning for the past 23 years. The bakery on Rue Saint-Pierre had belonged to his family since 1897, surviving one world war and now enduring another under occupation. The familiar routine of measuring flour, kneading dough, and shaping pastries provided small comfort in a world that had become unpredictable and dangerous. But this particular morning, something unusual happened that would accidentally transform his bakery into the communication hub for one of the most effective escape networks in occupied France. Madame Rousseau, a regular customer who purchased 2 baguettes every morning at 6:15, arrived at her usual time but paused at the counter longer than normal. She studied the croissants displayed in the window, then looked directly at Marcel and said something that seemed like a simple observation but carried layers of meaning he would only understand later. She remarked that the croissants today were shaped differently than usual, more curved at the ends, and asked if this was intentional. Marcel, confused by the question, explained that his assistant had shaped the morning batch while he worked on bread loaves, and perhaps the young man had formed them slightly differently. Madame Rousseau nodded slowly, purchased her usual order, and left. But she returned 3 hours later, which she had never done before, and purchased 6 more croissants, specifically requesting the ones with the curved ends. Over the following days, Marcel noticed a pattern that made no sense. Certain customers began requesting specific pastries based on their shape rather than their type or freshness. Some wanted croissants that curved left, others insisted on baguettes with 3 diagonal slashes rather than 4. A few customers requested the round rolls only if they had been scored in a cross pattern on top. Marcel assumed this was simply the peculiar behavior people developed under the stress of occupation, odd preferences that gave people small sense of control in a world where control had been stripped away. He accommodated these requests without much thought, shaping some pastries one way and others differently to satisfy whatever strange preferences his customers had developed. What Marcel did not know, what he could not have known, was that his bakery had accidentally become a communication system for the local resistance network, and the shapes he was creating in his pastries were being read as coded messages about patrol schedules, safe houses, and escape routes for Allied soldiers hiding in the region. The accidental code system that emerged around Marcel's bakery began several weeks earlier, when 2 separate resistance cells operating in Caen independently developed the same idea for passing information in plain sight. The occupation authorities monitored conversations, intercepted written messages, and arrested anyone suspected of resistance activity. Traditional communication methods had become impossibly dangerous. But food was essential, and bakeries were places where people naturally gathered without raising suspicion. One resistance member, a schoolteacher named Laurent Beaumont, had noticed that Marcel's bakery produced pastries with slight variations in shape depending on which assistant was working. He mentioned this observation to his resistance contact during a carefully orchestrated chance meeting in a public park. The observation sparked an idea. If pastry shapes varied naturally, those variations could be given meaning. A croissant curved strongly to the left could indicate one piece of information. A croissant curved right could indicate something different. The same principle could apply to how bread was scored before baking. The beauty of this system was that it required no explicit cooperation from the baker. The resistance members could simply request specific shapes and communicate information through their purchases without Marcel ever knowing he was part of a network. The system was tested in late February 1943 with a simple trial. One resistance member would request croissants curved left, purchase them, and leave them at a predetermined location. Another member would retrieve them, and the act of finding those specific croissants at that location would confirm the first message. The test worked perfectly. Marcel, asked for croissants shaped a particular way, simply accommodated what he thought was a customer preference. Within 2 weeks, the system had expanded to include multiple pastry variations, each assigned specific meaning by the resistance cells. A strongly curved croissant indicated heightened patrol activity in the northern district. A straighter croissant suggested normal conditions. Baguettes with 3 diagonal slashes meant safe houses in the western area were available. 4 slashes indicated those houses were compromised. Round rolls scored in a cross pattern signaled that an escape attempt would occur that evening. Rolls without scoring meant operations were postponed. The system worked because it exploited the natural variation in handmade bakery products. Marcel's assistants shaped pastries slightly differently based on their individual technique, the dough's consistency that day, and how rushed they were during preparation. These natural variations provided cover for the deliberate requests that carried meaning. To any observer, even occupation authorities who might notice customers requesting specific items, the behavior appeared as nothing more than people expressing preferences for certain shapes or styles of bread. By April 1943, the system had evolved beyond simple variations in pastry shape to include more sophisticated signals that allowed for more detailed information transfer. The position of items in the display window began carrying meaning. Croissants placed on the left side of the top shelf indicated different information than those on the right side or lower shelves. The number of specific items purchased communicated quantities or timing. A customer buying 5 croissants of a particular shape was conveying different information than someone buying 3. The elegance of this system was its deniability. If occupation authorities questioned why someone purchased 5 croissants instead of 2, the answer was simply that they were feeding a family or preferred to buy several days' worth at once. If questioned about why they preferred a specific shape, customers could explain they simply liked how those looked or found them easier to slice. Every element of the system had an innocent explanation that made investigation pointless. Marcel remained completely unaware that his bakery had become a communication hub. He noticed that certain customers had developed strong preferences for specific pastries, and he accommodated these preferences as any good baker would. He took pride in the fact that customers were particular about his products, interpreting their specificity as appreciation for his craftsmanship. His assistants learned to shape pastries in the various ways that different customers preferred, thinking they were simply providing good customer service. The first time Marcel's bakery directly contributed to saving lives came in late April 1943, when British RAF pilot named Flight Lieutenant James Whitmore was shot down near Caen. Whitmore had parachuted from his damaged bomber and was hiding in a farmhouse outside the city, cared for by a resistance sympathizer who needed to arrange his movement to a safe house in preparation for eventual evacuation to England. The resistance network needed to coordinate multiple elements. They needed to confirm the safe house was available, communicate the timing for Whitmore's transfer, and signal when conditions were secure for movement through the city. All of this information was passed through purchases at Marcel's bakery. A resistance member purchased baguettes with a specific slash pattern, confirming safe house availability. Another purchased croissants of a particular curve, indicating the transfer would occur after evening curfew. A third purchased round rolls with cross-scoring, signaling that lookouts were positioned and the route was clear. Marcel shaped the requested items, placed them in the requested locations in his display, and sold them to customers who seemed particularly pleased with their purchases. That evening, Flight Lieutenant James Whitmore was successfully moved to the safe house, hidden there for 6 days while papers were forged and transport arranged, then evacuated through a network that eventually got him to neutral Spain and back to England. He never knew that his rescue had been coordinated partly through the shapes of pastries in a bakery.
The expansion of the bakery code system through summer 1943 occurred organically as different resistance cells learned about the method and adapted it for their purposes. Word spread carefully through trusted networks that a bakery in Caen was being used for signaling, though the specific codes were kept compartmentalized so that if one cell was compromised, the entire system would not be exposed. By June 1943, Marcel's bakery was handling communication for at least 4 separate resistance groups operating in the Caen region, none of whom had complete knowledge of the others' activities. This compartmentalization meant that even if occupation authorities somehow discovered that the bakery was being used for signaling, they would not be able to unravel the entire network because no single person understood all the codes being used. The system evolved to include timing elements. Purchases made in the morning communicated different information than identical purchases made in the afternoon. A customer buying specific croissants at 7 a.m. was sending a different signal than one buying the same items at 2 p.m. This temporal dimension added another layer of complexity that made the code even harder to detect or decode. Marcel's daily routine continued unchanged. He arrived at 4:30 a.m. to begin preparation. He lit the ovens, mixed dough, shaped pastries, and opened the shop at 6 a.m. Customers arrived throughout the day, some regulars he had known for years, others new faces that became familiar over weeks. He fulfilled their requests, engaged in small talk about weather and shortages and the general difficulties of life under occupation, and closed the shop at 6 p.m. The only difference he noticed was that his customers had become more particular about their purchases, but he attributed this to people finding small pleasures and preferences during difficult times. The second documented rescue code involving the bakery code occurred in July 1943 when an American B-17 bomber crew was shot down during a daylight raid. 3 crew members who survived the crash and parachute landing were being sheltered by different families in villages surrounding Caen. The resistance needed to coordinate bringing all 3 to a central location for eventual group evacuation, which required complex timing and route planning. Over a period of 5 days, the entire operation was coordinated through purchases at Marcel's bakery. Different resistance members bought specific items that communicated locations, timing, and security conditions. The 3 American airmen were successfully gathered at a farm north of the city, hidden there for 2 weeks while arrangements were made, and then moved through a chain of safe houses that eventually led to their evacuation. The bakery's role in this operation involved nothing more than Marcel shaping pastries according to customer requests and selling them. He never met the airmen. He never knew they existed. He simply made bread and served his customers, unknowingly facilitating an operation that required precise coordination across multiple resistance cells. The system's sophistication reached its peak in August 1943 when resistance coordinators realized they could use the bakery not just for signaling, but for actual material transfer. Small items could be hidden inside bread loaves. A hollowed-out baguette could contain forged identity papers. A large round loaf could hide a radio component or small amount of ammunition. The transfer method was elegant in its simplicity. A resistance member would place an order for a special loaf specifying certain characteristics that Marcel would interpret as a custom order. Marcel would prepare the loaf, and during a brief moment when the bakery was empty or when an assistant was handling the front counter, another resistance member would quickly swap the normal loaf for an identical one that contained hidden materials. The customer would return to collect their order, pay, and leave with a loaf that appeared normal but contained items crucial to resistance operations. Marcel occasionally noticed that customers who ordered special loaves seemed particularly pleased with their purchases and sometimes returned them the next day, claiming they had ordered wrong and wanted something different. He assumed these were simply people being indecisive or particular during stressful times. The first major test of the material transfer system came when forged documents needed to reach a British intelligence operative working undercover in Caen. The documents, printed on thin paper, were rolled tightly and inserted into a specially prepared baguette. The baguette was picked up by a resistance member who delivered it to a predetermined drop point. The operative retrieved it, extracted the documents, and used them to establish a new identity that allowed him to continue gathering intelligence for several more months. Throughout all of this activity, Marcel maintained his focus on what he understood to be his job, baking quality bread and pastries for his community. He took pride in his work, maintaining standards even as ingredient shortages made his craft more challenging. Flour was rationed and often of poor quality. Sugar was nearly impossible to obtain. Butter had been replaced with substitutes that changed how pastries browned and tasted.
Yet Marcel adapted his recipes and techniques, determined that his bakery would continue producing the best possible products under difficult circumstances. His dedication to his craft inadvertently made the code system more effective. Because Marcel cared deeply about the quality and appearance of his products, customers could request specific characteristics, knowing he would fulfill those requests with attention to detail. A customer asking for croissants with a particular curve could trust that Marcel would shape them precisely as requested, because he took pride in meeting customer preferences. By September 1943, the bakery code system was handling communication for operations that extended beyond Caen to connect with networks in other regions. Resistance members traveling between cities would carry information about the code system, allowing it to be replicated in other locations. Several bakeries across Normandy began serving similar functions, each with their own specific codes adapted to local conditions and needs.
The closest the system came to exposure occurred in October 1943, when occupation authorities, suspicious of increased resistance activity in the Caen region, began more systematic observation of places where people gathered. Bakeries, markets, and churches all received increased attention from soldiers and collaborators who watched for suspicious behavior or conversations. Marcel noticed the increased presence of soldiers near his bakery, but assumed this was part of general security measures. He continued his daily routine without change because he genuinely had nothing to hide. He was simply baking bread and serving customers. The resistance network, aware of the increased surveillance, modified their communication protocols without abandoning the bakery system. Instead of multiple members making specific purchases in sequence, they spread out their visits over longer periods. Instead of requesting unusual items, they focused on more subtle variations that would be less noticeable to observers. The system became more refined under pressure, developing characteristics that made it even harder to detect. A resistance coordinator later explained in post-war testimony that the bakery system survived scrutiny because it exploited a fundamental truth about human behavior under occupation. Everyone was particular about food because food was one of the few areas where personal choice still existed. Someone requesting a specific type of bread or preferring certain pastries was exhibiting completely normal behavior. The occupation authorities could not investigate every person who expressed a food preference without harassing the entire population. During this period of heightened surveillance, the bakery system facilitated one of its most significant operations: the evacuation of a downed Allied pilot who had been injured during his parachute landing and required medical attention before he could be moved. The operation required coordinating between resistance members with medical connections, those who managed safe houses, and those who handled eventual evacuation routes. The coordination was accomplished through carefully timed purchases at Marcel's bakery over a period of 8 days. Specific pastry combinations communicated the pilot's medical status, the readiness of safe houses, and the security situation along potential evacuation routes. The pilot received treatment, recovered sufficiently to travel, and was successfully evacuated to England, all coordinated through purchases of bread and pastries. Marcel shaped the requested items, sold them to customers, and never suspected that he had facilitated an operation involving a dozen people across multiple locations. The winter of 1943-1944 brought new challenges as ingredient shortages became more severe and occupation authorities tightened rationing controls. Marcel struggled to maintain his bakery's operation with increasingly limited supplies. Flour rations were reduced. The small amounts of butter and sugar that had been available disappeared entirely. Fuel for the ovens was strictly rationed. Yet Marcel adapted, developing recipes that worked with available ingredients and maintaining his commitment to serving his community. The resistance network adapted alongside him. As Marcel's available products changed due to shortages, the code system evolved to use whatever items he could still produce. If croissants became impossible to make without butter, the signals previously communicated through croissant shapes were transferred to bread scoring patterns or the shapes of simple rolls that could be made with minimal ingredients. The bakery's most intensive period of operation came in the weeks leading up to June 1944, when Allied invasion plans required extensive coordination between resistance networks and Allied command. Intelligence needed to flow about beach defenses, troop positions, and infrastructure conditions. Resistance members needed to coordinate sabotage operations and prepare for supporting the invasion once it began. The volume of communication increased dramatically, and Marcel's bakery handled much of this increased traffic without Marcel ever understanding the scale of what was passing through his shop. In May 1944, Marcel noticed that some of his regular customers had become even more particular about their purchases, sometimes returning multiple times in a single day with specific requests. He assumed this reflected the increasing stress everyone felt as military activity in the region intensified. The occupation authorities were clearly preparing for something, increasing patrols and fortifying positions. Marcel assumed his customers were nervous and finding comfort in the routine of buying bread. The reality was that resistance networks were passing detailed information about occupation force movements, defensive preparations, and logistical activities. Each purchase of specifically shaped pastries communicated observations about troop positions. Each request for bread with particular scoring patterns conveyed information about fortification work. The bakery had become a real-time intelligence relay point, feeding information that would be compiled and transmitted to Allied command in England. On June 5, 1944, Marcel followed his normal routine, completely unaware that the invasion would begin the following morning. He shaped bread and pastries according to customer requests, served regular customers and a few unfamiliar faces, and closed the shop at his usual time. That evening, several resistance members made final purchases that communicated confirmation of various preparations. Security was in place. Sabotage teams were ready. Reception committees were prepared to assist Allied forces once they landed. All of this information passed through purchases of bread shaped and scored in specific ways, sold by a baker who simply thought he was serving customers who had particular preferences. When the invasion began on June 6, 1944, Marcel's bakery was in one of the regions that would see intense fighting as Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches. The bakery survived the initial bombardment, but was damaged in subsequent fighting. Marcel and his family evacuated to a relative's home in the countryside, joining thousands of other civilians fleeing the combat zone. The bakery code system ended not through exposure or betrayal, but simply because the physical location that had enabled it was no longer operational. When Marcel returned to Caen in late June after the Allied breakthrough, he found his bakery damaged but repairable. Windows were broken, the roof had holes from shrapnel, and the ovens needed repairs, but the basic structure survived. He began the process of rebuilding, scrounging materials, repairing damage, and eventually resuming operations in August 1944. His first customers after reopening were Allied soldiers who purchased whatever bread he had available without particular requests about shape or scoring. Marcel sold them his products and engaged in simple conversations through broken French and English, never mentioning that his bakery had played any role in the resistance. The revelation of what Marcel's bakery had actually been used for was in September 1944, when a resistance coordinator named Claude Mercier visited the shop and asked to speak with Marcel privately. Mercier explained carefully that he needed to inform Marcel about something that had been occurring without Marcel's knowledge. Over the course of an hour, Mercier described the code system that had operated through the bakery for more than a year. Marcel's initial reaction was disbelief. He insisted that he had simply been baking bread and serving customers. Mercier explained patiently that yes, that was exactly what Marcel had been doing, but the specific shapes and patterns that customers requested had carried meaning that enabled resistance operations. Mercier showed Marcel a written key that explained some of the codes. Croissants curved left had meant one thing. Baguettes with 3 slashes had meant another. The placement of items in the display window had communicated additional information. Marcel studied the list and slowly began to understand how his innocent accommodation of customer preferences had been transformed into a sophisticated communication system. His second reaction was concern. Had he unknowingly endangered himself and his family?
Mercier assured him that the beauty of the system was that Marcel's genuine ignorance had protected him. If occupation authorities had investigated, they would have found a baker fulfilling customer requests with no knowledge of any resistance activity. His innocence had been the system's greatest security feature. Marcel's third reaction was a question. Had it actually helped? Mercier's answer provided the first indication of the system's scope. He explained that communications passed through the bakery had contributed to successful evacuation of dozens of Allied airmen, coordination of sabotage operations, and intelligence gathering that supported the invasion. The exact number of lives saved or operations enabled could never be calculated precisely because the system had been used by multiple independent resistance cells, but it had certainly been significant. Over the following months, as the region recovered from occupation and life slowly returned to some version of normal, Marcel occasionally encountered people who thanked him for his role in the resistance. He struggled with these expressions of gratitude because he maintains that he had not knowingly done anything beyond baking bread. The thanking parties would explain that yes, his bread had saved their lives, or helped evacuate their cousin, or enabled an operation they participated in. Marcel gradually came to understand that his skill as a baker and his commitment to serving customers had been transformed by others into something larger than he intended. The documentation of the bakery code system came gradually in the post-war period as resistance members compiled records of their operations for historical purposes. Multiple independent accounts mentioned using a bakery in Caen for communication, and eventually these accounts were correlated to identify Marcel's establishment as the common location. The estimated total of 127 Allied soldiers whose evacuation was directly or indirectly facilitated by communications through the bakery comes from this compilation of resistance records cross-referenced with Allied escape and evasion reports. The post-war recognition of Marcel Dupont's inadvertent contribution to resistance operations developed slowly and created complicated feelings for Marcel himself. In 1946, he was invited to a ceremony honoring resistance members and was presented with a certificate of appreciation for his role in evacuation networks. He accepted the recognition, but remained uncomfortable with being called a resistance hero when he maintained he had simply been baking bread. The resistance coordinators who had used his bakery understood Marcel's perspective, but tried to help him see that his contribution had been valuable precisely because it was genuine. His authentic focus on his craft had made the code system work. If he had been consciously participating in resistance activity, his behavior might have changed in ways that attracted attention. His innocent accommodation of customer preferences had provided perfect cover for sophisticated operations. The bakery code system influenced post-war thinking about resistance operations and civilian involvement in intelligence networks. Military historians studying the French resistance identified the bakery system as an example of effective tradecraft that exploited normal civilian activity for operational purposes. The system demonstrated several principles that became documented in intelligence training. First, communication systems built on normal activity were harder to detect than those requiring unusual behavior. Second, compartmentalization protected networks by ensuring no single person understood the complete operation. Third, genuine innocence could provide better operational security than elaborate cover stories. The specific codes used at Marcel's bakery were documented in resistance archives and studied as examples of practical improvised cryptography. The system had not used sophisticated encryption, but rather simple substitution where common items conveyed agreed-upon meanings. The security came not from complexity, but from the fact that the communication medium was so ordinary that observation revealed nothing suspicious. Marcel continued operating his bakery through the post-war Reconstruction period and into the 1950s. He maintained his commitment to quality despite continuing ingredient shortages and economic challenges. His bakery became known locally not primarily for its resistance history, but for the quality of its bread and pastries, which is how Marcel preferred to be known. The story of the bakery code system remained relatively obscure until the 1970s, when historians researching civilian contributions to resistance operations began compiling detailed accounts of various networks.
Marcel was interviewed several times during this period, and his testimony provided valuable details about the practical aspects of how the system had functioned from his perspective. He described how customers had made specific requests, how he had accommodated those requests without suspecting their significance, and how he had slowly come to understand after the war what had actually been occurring. Resistance members who had used the system were also interviewed, providing their perspective on how they had developed the codes, coordinated purchases, and used the information that was passed through pastry shapes and bread scoring. These interviews revealed that multiple independent cells had developed similar systems for using the bakery, often without knowing about each other's codes. This accidental redundancy had actually strengthened the network because compromise of one cell's codes would not have exposed the entire operation.
Marcel Dupont passed away in 1979 at the age of 81, having operated his bakery for over 50 years. His obituary in the local Caen newspaper mentioned his resistance contribution alongside his reputation as a master baker who had served his community through war and peace. The bakery code system succeeded because it was built on authentic, normal activity rather than elaborate deception. Marcel's genuine focus on his craft provided perfect cover because there was nothing false about his behavior that observers could detect. The customer requests that carried coded meaning appeared as normal preferences because they were communicated by people purchasing products they would legitimately buy. The resistance members who developed and used the system demonstrated sophisticated understanding of tradecraft principles, even though most were civilians without formal intelligence training. They recognized that communication needed to appear innocent, that codes needed to be simple enough to remember without written keys, and that the entire system needed to function even if individual participants were compromised. The system's accidental nature, with Marcel operating in genuine ignorance of the codes he was facilitating, created a form of operational security that conscious participation could not match. If interrogated by occupation authorities about suspicious activity in his bakery, Marcel could honestly testify that he was simply serving customers and fulfilling their requests for specific types of bread and pastries. This genuine innocence protected Marcel and the resistance network that depended on his bakery. The story challenges simple narratives about resistance requiring conscious, heroic choice. Marcel's contribution was significant precisely because it was unconscious. His commitment to his craft and his customer service created the conditions that resistance members exploited for their operations. His heroism, if it can be called that, lay in maintaining his professional standards and serving his community under difficult circumstances, not in deliberately taking risks for political or military purposes. The modern recognition of the bakery code system appears in several museums and historical sites in Normandy that document resistance operations. Displays explain how everyday activities and locations became tools for resistance, with the bakery code system featured as a prime example. These exhibits help visitors understand that resistance involved not just dramatic sabotage and armed conflict, but also quiet exploitation of normal civilian life for operational purposes. Marcel's story, which remained largely unknown for decades, represents countless similar stories of people whose ordinary activities were transformed by circumstances into extraordinary contributions. His experience illustrates how war creates situations where professional competence and dedication to craft can become forms of resistance even without conscious political commitment. The shapes of croissants and the scoring patterns on bread carried meaning because someone cared enough about baking to shape pastries precisely according to customer preferences. That professional pride, maintained through years of occupation and privation, inadvertently enabled operations that saved lives and supported military objectives. The legacy of Marcel Dupont and his bakery serves as a reminder that heroism takes many forms, and that contributions to great causes sometimes come from people who never sought recognition or even understood the full significance of their actions. The baker who shaped bread according to customer preferences, the customers who made specific requests,
and the resistance coordinators who transformed those everyday transactions into an intelligence network all played their roles in a system that exemplified resistance through the ordinary. This is what makes the story worth preserving and telling, not because it features dramatic action or conscious heroism, but because it reveals how commitment to craft, service to community, and maintenance of normal life under abnormal circumstances can themselves become forms of resistance that matter profoundly to outcomes that extend far beyond any individual's awareness or intention.